Amara Bennett stood barefoot on the cold marble of her kitchen floor, with one hand pressed flat against her stomach, as if she could shield the baby inside her just by holding on tight enough. 7 months pregnant, 29 years old, and terrified in her own home. Her lip was split, not badly, just enough that she could taste copper every time she swallowed. Her cheek was already starting to swell where Derek's hand had connected, and her wrist throbbed where he'd grabbed her to keep her from walking away mid-argument, the way he always did when he wasn't finished talking. He was finished now. She could hear him down the hall, pouring himself a drink in his study with the particular calm of a man who believed he'd done nothing wrong. That was the part that scared her most, not the hitting, the calm after it, like he'd corrected something. Like she was the mess and he was simply cleaning up. She looked down at her stomach. The baby kicked. Once, hard. And something in Amara, something that had been folding smaller and smaller for 3 years, finally refused to fold anymore. She picked up her phone with a hand that wouldn't stop shaking. She scrolled past her mother's contact, past her best friend Jasmine's, past the family lawyer Derek had picked out for her, the one who technically worked for her but somehow always seemed to be protecting the Whitmore name instead. She stopped on a name she hadn't called in over a year. Tae-hyun. No last name saved. No title. Just the one word. The way she'd typed it into her phone the day he told her, half joking, half not. You'll never need anyone else's number if you have mine. She used to believe that. Then she'd married into a world that made her feel like calling her own brother was a betrayal of her new family. And she'd let the calls get further and further apart until times further apart, times became times almost never, until the version of herself who used to call Tae-hyun just to hear his voice felt like someone else entirely. Her thumb hovered over his name. She thought about what would happen if she called him. She thought about what would happen if she didn't. She pressed call. It rang once, twice. On the third ring, she almost hung up. She told herself she was overreacting, that she could handle this the way she always handled it, quietly, alone, by morning. He answered on the fourth ring. Amara? His voice was awake. Instantly, completely awake, the way it always was no matter what hour she called, like some part of him had been standing by for this exact moment for years. She opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Her throat had closed around the words the way it always did right before she cried. And she hated that even now her body wanted to protect Derek's secret instead of telling the truth. Amara. His voice changed, not louder, quieter, sharper at the edges. Talk to me, Tae-hyun. Her voice came out thin, wrong, barely hers. Where are you? Home. Is he there? She glanced toward the hallway. She could hear the ice in his glass. In his study. I think he's done for the night. A pause. She could hear him moving on the other end. A door, keys, something metal set down hard on a counter. Did he touch you? Silence. Amara. Still quiet. Quieter than before, which somehow made it worse. Did he put his hands on you? She closed her eyes. She felt the tears come the way water comes through a crack you've been pretending isn't there. Yes, she whispered. Nothing. For a full 3 seconds, nothing, no breath, no sound, no words. And in that silence, Amara understood something about her brother that she had spent years trying not to look at directly. That there was a version of Tae-hyun that only came out when someone he loved was in danger, and she was hearing it arrive right now, on the other end of a phone line, in real time. Is the baby okay? He asked. Steady again, focused. I think she's fine. I felt her move. Good. A breath. Good. Listen to me very carefully. Tae-hyun, you don't have to. Amara, not raised, never raised, just final. I'm not asking permission. I'm telling you what's happening next. You're going to pack a bag. Small. Just what you need for tonight. You're not going to wake him. You're not going to explain anything to him. You understand? She nodded even though he couldn't see it. Okay, I'm coming. And then the line went dead. Amara stood in her kitchen with the phone still pressed to her ear, long after the call ended, listening to nothing, feeling something shift in her chest that she hadn't felt in 3 years. Not fear, not exactly. Something closer to the first cold breath of air after being underwater too long. Down the hall, she heard Derek's chair creak as he settled deeper into it, already forgetting, already moving on, already certain that whatever had just happened between them was over and handled and would never leave this house. He had no idea what he'd just done. He had no idea who he just hurt. And in less than an hour, he was going to find out. If this story already has your heart racing, that's exactly where I want you, because this is only a taste of what's coming. Before we go any further, hit subscribe right now so you don't miss where this goes, because I promise you, the moment Tae-hyun walks through that door is not even close to the peak of this story. Drop a like if you're already on Amara's side, and in the comments, tell me what city or country you're watching from tonight. I read every single one, and I want to see exactly how far I'm coming travels. Now let's keep going. 3 miles away, in a penthouse that overlooked the same dark river Amara could see from her own window, Kang Tae-hyun set his phone down on black marble and stood very still for exactly 4 seconds. 4 seconds was all he allowed himself. Then he moved. He didn't call anyone yet. He didn't raise his voice, didn't slam a door, didn't do any of the things a normal man might do in this moment. He pulled a jacket from the closet, checked the time, and walked to the elevator with the unhurried, deliberate calm of a man who had spent 20 years training himself never to let anyone see exactly how dangerous he'd become. Because that was the truth about Tae-hyun that almost no one in Amara's world understood. To the city of Chicago, he was a quiet, wealthy Korean businessman shipping, logistics, real estate, the kind of name that showed up on charity boards and never in headlines. To a very different, much smaller circle of people, the kind of people who moved money through countries without asking questions, the kind of people who made problems disappear and occasionally made people disappear too. Kang Tae-hyun was not a businessman at all. He was something else entirely. And in 20 minutes, Derek Whitmore was going to open his front door to find out exactly what. Derek Whitmore heard the knock at 11:47 p.m. and didn't think much of it. 3 knocks. Even, unhurried. He set his glass down on the side table, straightened his shirt out of habit, the same habit that made him fix his collar before every board meeting, every gala, every photo with his father's name behind him on a building, and walked to the door already composing the version of himself he was about to perform. Charming, slightly amused, a man mildly inconvenienced by a late visitor. He opened the door expecting a courier, a neighbor, maybe a driver with the wrong address. He was not expecting the man standing in his doorway. Tae-hyun was not tall in the way that made a room notice him physically. He didn't need to be. He stood with his hands loose at his sides, a dark coat over a plain black shirt, and an expression so calm it took Derek a full 3 seconds to understand that calm was not the same thing as harmless. "Can I help you?" Derek asked, already reaching for the doorframe the way men do when they want to look relaxed and end up looking exactly the opposite. "Where's my sister?" 2 words too late, Derek placed the face. He'd only met Tae-hyun once, at the wedding, for less than 10 minutes, in a receiving line where Derek had shaken 100 hands and forgotten most of the names attached to them. He remembered this one now, mostly because Amara had gripped his arm a little tighter when she introduced them, and he'd assumed at the time it was pride. He understood now it had been something closer to warning. Tae-hyun, right? Derek forced a smile, wide, easy, practiced. It's late, man. Everything okay? Where is she? Derek's smile held for exactly one more second before something in him, some old animal instinct that had nothing to do with money or last names, told him this was not a conversation he was going to win by being charming. She's upstairs, asleep. Look, whatever this is about, get her things. Excuse me? You heard me. Taehyun's voice never rose. That was the part that would keep Derek awake for weeks afterward. How a man could say something that felt like the floor dropping out from under him, and never once raise his voice to do it. Pack her a bag. She's leaving tonight. Derek laughed a short, disbelieving sound, the laugh of a man who genuinely could not process what was happening to him. This is my house. She's my wife. She's 7 months pregnant with my child, and you're going to stand on my porch at midnight and tell me you put your hands on her. The words landed in the space between them and didn't move. Derek's mouth opened, closed. For one brief, unguarded moment, something flickered across his face that wasn't anger, it was closer to fear. Quick and involuntary, the look of a man realizing that a door he thought was locked had just swung open on its own. That's not, he started. You don't understand the situation. Amara can be careful. One word, quiet as the first. Derek stopped talking. Behind him, at the top of the stairs, Amara appeared with a small bag already packed, her coat over her arm, her face pale in the hallway light. She hadn't waited for permission from either of them. She'd simply done what her brother told her to do the moment she heard the knock, the way you move fast when you finally trust that help has actually arrived. Derek turned. Amara, don't. Her voice cracked on the single syllable, but it held. Don't say my name like that. Not tonight. You're 7 months pregnant, Derek said. And for the first time, his voice shifted into something almost pleading, almost soft, the tone he used when he needed her compliant. Where exactly do you think you're going at midnight? With him? Amara looked at her husband for a long moment. She thought about 3 years of small apologies that were never quite apologies. 3 years of bruises she'd learned to explain away to friends who'd stopped asking. 3 years of telling herself that love was supposed to feel this exhausting. Somewhere you can't reach me, she said. She walked down the stairs. She walked past Derek without looking at him again. And when she reached the door, Tae-hyun stepped aside just enough to let her through first, not turning his back on Derek even for a second, not once breaking eye contact with the man who had put his hands on his sister. This isn't over, Derek said, and there was an edge in his voice now, something ugly starting to surface underneath the composure. You understand that. My family isn't going to just let this. I know exactly who your family is. Taehyun's tone hadn't changed once in the entire conversation. That was what made it terrifying. I'd think very carefully before you decide to test what happens next. Is that a threat? Tae-hyun looked at him the way you'd look at something small and briefly interesting. No, he said. It's a courtesy. I'm only going to give you one. He turned and followed his sister down the front steps into the cold, leaving Derek standing alone in his own doorway, his pulse loud in his ears, replaying that sentence over and over and trying to figure out why, for the first time in his adult life, he felt genuinely, physically afraid of another man. The car was silent for the first several blocks. Amara sat with both hands wrapped around her stomach, staring out the window at the city sliding past the same city she'd lived in her entire life, suddenly looking unfamiliar from inside a car she didn't recognize, driven by a man she was only now starting to realize she barely knew either. "You didn't have to come," she said finally. Her voice was small in the quiet car. "Yes, I did. He's going to make this hard. His family has lawyers. His mother—" She stopped, shook her head. "You don't know what they're capable of." "I know exactly what they're capable of," Tae-hyun said, eyes on the road. "That's not what you need to be worried about tonight." "Then what do I need to be worried about?" He glanced at her, and for just a second, something in his expression softened, not the cold stillness from the doorway, but something older, something that had nothing to do with threats or warnings. Something that remembered a 6-year-old girl who used to fall asleep in the back of a different car a long time ago, in a different life, before either of them had any idea what the world was going to ask of them. "Nothing," he said. "Not anymore. You're safe now." Amara wanted to believe him completely. Some old, exhausted part of her still did. But another part of her, the part that had spent 3 years learning to read rooms and predict violence before it happened, noticed the way his jaw had tightened the moment. Derek said, "Times, my family isn't going to just let this." She noticed the way his hand had gone very still on the wheel. She noticed that her brother, who had not raised his voice once in that entire doorway conversation, had a version of calm that felt less like peace and more like the eye of something enormous still gathering strength. "Tae-hyun." She turned to look at him fully. "What exactly do you do? For work? Really?" The city lights moved across his face, on and off, as the car crossed intersection after intersection. "Tonight," he said, "let's just get you somewhere safe first." It wasn't an answer. She noticed that too. She didn't push. Not yet. She was too tired, too shaken, too grateful to be moving away from that house instead of toward it. But somewhere underneath the exhaustion, a small, sharp thought settled in and refused to leave. "My brother just made a very wealthy, very powerful man go pale with 2 sentences. Who is he, really?" She didn't know it yet, but 3 miles behind them, in a house that suddenly felt too large and too quiet, Derek Whitmore was already on the phone with his father, hands shaking, voice tight, trying to explain what had just happened in a way that didn't make him sound as rattled as he felt. And on the other end of that call, a much older, much more careful man was about to ask a single question that would change everything. "What did you say his name was?" Richard Whitmore was 73 years old and had not been afraid of another human being in over 30 years. He'd built that fearlessness the old-fashioned way, decade by decade, deal by deal, by making sure that every person who ever crossed him understood exactly what it cost to do it again. Judges took his calls. Senators owed him favors they'd spent years trying to forget. The Whitmore name opened doors in this city that didn't open for anyone else, and Richard had long ago stopped bothering to knock. So when his son called him at midnight, voice tight and clipped in a way Richard hadn't heard since Derek was a teenager caught in some scrape he couldn't talk his way out of, Richard's first instinct wasn't fear. It was mild, weary irritation. "Slow down," Richard said, settling into the leather chair in his study, phone against his ear, brandy already poured. "Start from the beginning." "Amara's brother showed up at the house," Derek said. "He took her. Just walked in and took her, Dad. Middle of the night." Her brother. Richard almost laughed. He remembered the wedding vaguely. A quiet, well-dressed Korean man standing near the back of the reception, polite, unremarkable, gone before the toasts were finished. "The businessman?" "Yeah, him." And he simply walked into your home and removed your wife. He didn't ask, Dad. He told me. Told me to pack her bag. Told me. Derek's voice cracked slightly, and Richard heard something in it he didn't recognize from his son. Not anger. Something closer to unease. There was something about the way he said it, like he wasn't even worried I'd say no. Richard swirled the brandy in his glass, unbothered. This was, in his considerable experience, exactly the kind of thing that happened when families like the Bennetts, modest, unconnected, forgettable families, got a taste of proximity to real money and real power, and momentarily forgot their place in the order of things. A brother playing protector. It would resolve itself within a week, the way it always did, once the appropriate attorney made the appropriate phone call. I'll have Harmon reach out to her in the morning, Richard said. We'll discuss the terms of a temporary arrangement. This is not complicated, Derek. People make mistakes when they're emotional. We give it a few days, we handle it through counsel, and this quietly disappears the way everything quietly disappears. He said something else. Derek's voice dropped lower. Before he left, he said he knew exactly who our family was, and that I should think very carefully before I test what happens next. Richard's hand stopped moving. The brandy sat still in the glass. What's his name? Richard said. Slower now. Different. Kang Tae-won. Silence on the line. A long one. Long enough that Derek said his father's name twice before Richard finally answered. And when he did, his voice had lost every trace of the weary amusement it started with. Say that again. Kang Tae-won. Dad, what? Spell it. Derek spelled it, confused now, watching his father's silence stretch out through the phone like something physically expanding in the room between them. Richard set the brandy glass down on the side table with a hand that was, for the first time in longer than he could remember, not entirely steady. He knew the name. Not from a wedding reception, not from some minor social introduction he'd half forgotten. He knew it from a conversation 8 years earlier, in a private room at a club that didn't advertise its membership, when a man Richard had trusted for 2 decades had leaned across the table, and in the careful, quiet way people speak when they genuinely do not want to be overheard, told him a story about a construction deal in the Pacific Northwest that had collapsed overnight. A deal involving 3 very powerful, very careless men who had, without realizing it, made an enemy of someone connected to a name that moved through Seoul and Chicago and half a dozen ports across 2 continents like water through a system nobody could see the pipes of. 2 of those 3 men had lost everything within a year. Businesses, reputations. In one case, considerably more than that. The third man had simply vanished from public life entirely, and no one Richard knew had ever asked what happened to him, because everyone Richard knew understood, instinctively, that some questions were more dangerous than the answers. The name attached to that story had been Kang. Dad, Derek's voice small now, waiting. What is it? Richard stood up slowly. He walked to the window of his study and looked out at the dark shape of the city, at the river he couldn't see but knew was there, cutting through the middle of everything like it always had. Get out of the house, Richard said. What? Tonight, now. Go to the lakeshore property. Don't call her. Don't text her. Don't go near that man again until I tell you it's safe to. Dad, you're scaring me. What do you know that I don't? Richard closed his eyes. I know that you may have just done something that no amount of money in this family can fix, he said quietly. Now get out of that house. 3 miles north, in the 8th floor apartment Tae-won had installed her in without a single question asked, Amara sat at a small kitchen table with a mug of tea going cold in front of her. watching her brother move quietly through the space, checking the locks on windows that were already locked, the way he'd been doing since they arrived. "You're not going to tell me, are you?" she said. He didn't stop what he was doing. "Tell you what you actually do." She wrapped both hands around the mug. "I've spent 3 years married into a family that made me feel small for asking questions. I'm done doing that with you too." Tae-hyun finally stopped. He turned and looked at her, really looked at her, in a way that made her feel, for just a moment, like the 9-year-old girl who used to trail behind him around their mother's house, asking 100 questions he never seemed to mind answering. "Not tonight," he said. "Tonight you rest. You let your body calm down. You let the baby calm down. And tomorrow?" Something crossed his face, not hesitation exactly, but the particular stillness of a man deciding how much truth a person can hold at one time. "Tomorrow," he said, "some things are going to start happening that you're not going to fully understand yet. People are going to react to my name in ways that are going to surprise you. I need you to trust that whatever you see, whatever you hear, it's happening because I am protecting you, not because I've become someone you should be afraid of." Amara studied him for a long moment. "That's not really an answer either," she said quietly. "No," he admitted. "It isn't." He crossed the kitchen and knelt slightly beside her chair, the way he used to when she was small and upset about something that felt enormous at the time and turned out, later, to be nothing at all. He put one hand gently over both of hers where they wrapped around the mug. "I need you to sleep," he said. "Tomorrow is going to be a very long day." She wanted to push further. She wanted, more than anything, the full truth right now, tonight, in this quiet kitchen where it felt almost safe enough to hear it. But she was exhausted in a way that went deeper than her body, and some old, trusting part of her, the part that had called him at 11:47 without hesitating, once she finally decided to let her set the questions down for tonight. She didn't know. As she walked down the hall to the guest room and finally let herself cry from relief instead of fear, that 70 floors below in a hotel bar on the other side of the city, a man was quietly ending a phone call with 2 words that would put Taehyun's entire name back into circulation among people who had spent 8 years hoping they'd never have to hear it again. "He's back." The man who said "times he's back" times into a hotel bar phone that night was named Elias Moreno, and by morning his warning had already traveled through 4 cities. By noon, it had reached Richard Whitmore's attorney, a careful, gray-haired man named Daniel Cross, who called Richard at his office and, without preamble, resigned as counsel to the Whitmore family effective immediately. "Daniel, we've worked together for 11 years, Richard said, gripping the phone. "You don't just walk away from—" "I'm not walking away from the Whitmore account, Richard." Cross's voice was tight, controlled. A man choosing every word like it might be recorded and used against him someday. "I'm walking away from whatever this has become." Kang Tae-hyun's family moved $400 million through Seoul and 3 American ports last year alone, and none of it shows up anywhere it's supposed to. I have represented difficult clients my entire career. I am not representing anyone who is currently the personal enemy of that man. I'd advise you to find someone who doesn't have children. The line went dead before Richard could respond. He sat in his office for a long time after that, staring at nothing, doing what he did best, running numbers, calculating exposure, searching for the angle that would make this problem behave like every other problem he'd ever solved, with money and patience. He found none. By that evening, 2 more calls came in. A security consultant the Whitmores had used for 15 years quietly declined to renew his contract, citing In careful corporate language, a shift in risk profile. A Judge Richard had known socially for 2 decades the kind of relationship built on golf and campaign contributions, and the unspoken understanding that certain calls got returned didn't return his call at all. One by one, the machinery that had protected the Whitmore name for 3 generations was quietly, politely stepping back, the way people step back from a fire before they understand exactly how large it's about to get. Richard finally understood what his son had walked into. Kang Tae-won was not a wealthy businessman with a temper and a protective streak. He was the person other powerful men were taught, in whispered warnings passed between generations, of the kind of people who ran things quietly, never to cross. His organization moved through shipping routes and shell investments and quiet real estate purchases across 2 continents, invisible to anyone who wasn't already deep enough inside the world to know where to look, and utterly ruthless toward anyone who threatened the small handful of things he actually cared about, which, as of 11:47 the previous night, now officially included his sister. Amara didn't learn the full truth from her brother. She learned it the way the rest of the city was learning it, in fragments, in the sudden, strange silence that fell over people who used to talk freely about her husband's family, in the way a hotel concierge at the building where they'd relocated addressed Tae-hyun with a level of careful deference that had nothing to do with a generous tip. She confronted him about it 3 days later, standing in the small kitchen of the apartment with her hand braced against the counter, the baby restless inside her, sleep still not fully caught up. "I need you to tell me the truth," she said. "All of it. Not the version you think I can handle. The actual truth." Tae-hyun looked at her for a long moment. Then, for the first time in his adult life, he told his sister everything. He told her about the years after their mother died, when he was 19 and she was 11 and the state had nearly separated them, and about the man who'd offered him a way to keep that from happening, a way that came with debts he was still paying off 2 decades later. He told her about the businesses that were real and the businesses that existed only on paper. He told her about the things he'd done to protect the people inside his small, careful circle, and the things he'd allowed to happen to people outside it, because that had always been the cost of keeping her and their mother safe when there was no one else who would. He didn't soften any of it. He didn't ask her to forgive it. "I built something dangerous," he said quietly, "because the alternative was losing you. I would build it again." Amara stood in the quiet kitchen with tears on her face that weren't entirely sadness and weren't entirely relief either, something more complicated than either, something closer to finally, fully knowing the person who had shown up in her doorway at midnight her entire life. "Okay," she said finally. "Okay? I'm not asking you to be someone else," she said. "I'm asking you to never lie to me again. That's all. That's the only thing I need from you." He nodded once. Done. The war, when it finally came, was shorter than anyone expected because Amara made sure of it. She had spent 3 years inside the Whitmore family's business dealings, quiet and watchful. The way you learn to watch a room when speaking up in it has never once gone well for you. She'd sat in on meetings Derek didn't think she was paying attention to. She'd seen documents left open on shared drives, contracts routed through companies that existed for exactly one transaction before disappearing. She'd noticed, without ever fully understanding what she was noticing, that Whitmore Global's biggest infrastructure contracts had a habit of running through the same handful of shell companies over and over, year after year. She hadn't known what any of it meant. She knew now. "This," she said, sliding a folder across the table to her brother 4 days later, "is everything I copied before I left. Financial statements, contractor agreements, 2 years of internal emails between Richard and a man named Blackwell that I was never supposed to see. Tae-hyun opened the folder slowly. As he read, something shifted behind his eyes, the specific, focused stillness of a man realizing that the woman across from him had just handed him something worth more than any threat he could have made himself. "You've had this the entire time," he said. "I didn't know what it was worth," she said. "I just knew it felt wrong, and I kept it, just in case." "Amara." He looked up at her, and for once, the careful control in his voice cracked into something raw, something that sounded almost like pride. "Do you understand what you're holding? Tell me. This is federal fraud, years of it, enough to end Whitmore Global entirely, without me lifting a single finger." Amara sat back in her chair, one hand resting on her stomach, and felt something settle inside her that had nothing to do with her brother's protection at all. "Good," she said, "because I'm not interested in being saved anymore. I want to be the reason this ends." Richard Whitmore was in his study when the federal notification arrived, delivered not by phone but by two agents at his front door at 7 in the morning, and by the time he understood the scope of what had landed on his family, Vivian, sharper than her husband in every way that mattered, and the only person in the family who had seen this coming from the moment Tae-hyun's name resurfaced, had already begun distancing the family name from every account under active investigation. She did not call Amara to apologize. Vivian Whitmore had never been a woman who apologized. But she did call Tae-hyun once, 3 weeks later, and the conversation lasted under 2 minutes. "You could have destroyed all of us," she said. "You chose not to." "I chose to let the truth do it," he said. "There's a difference." "My son," she said, and something in her carefully composed voice wavered for the first time in the entire conversation, "made a choice he can't undo." "Yes," Tae-hyun said, "he did." Derek Whitmore was never charged criminally. The fraud belonged to his father and Richard Blackwell. Not to him, but he lost everything that had ever made him feel untouchable. The company, the name, the easy, effortless confidence of a man who had never once been told no and meant it. He moved out of the state within the year, and the last conversation he ever had with Amara was a single voicemail she never returned, in which he said, quietly, that he was sorry, a word she had waited 3 years to hear and no longer needed at all. Spring came to Chicago the way it always did, reluctantly, and then all at once. Amara stood in a small park near her new apartment, with her daughter asleep against her chest, 6 weeks old. The same fierce kick in her tiny fist that Amara remembered feeling from the inside months earlier. Tae-hyun sat beside her on the bench, coffee in hand, watching the baby with an expression Amara had genuinely never seen on his face before. Something unguarded, something that had nothing to do with power or protection or 20 years of careful control. "You built a life without needing me to hold it up," he said quietly. "That's the part I'm proudest of. Not the folder, not any of it. That." Amara looked at her daughter, then at her brother, then out at the city that had almost broken her and hadn't. "I was so afraid to call you that night," she admitted. "I sat on that kitchen floor for 20 minutes before I picked up the phone. I know. I don't want to ever be that afraid again." Tae-hyun looked at her, steady, certain, the same calm he'd carried into Derek's doorway that midnight and never once let go of since. "You won't have to be," he said, "because now you know exactly who's coming." And that's the story of a woman who found her voice, and the brother who never once let her fight alone right up until the moment she didn't need him to. If this story kept you here until the very last word, do me one favor before you go. Hit that subscribe button. This channel puts out stories exactly like this one every single week. The kind that grab you in the first 2 minutes and don't let go until the last. and I don't want you to miss a single one. Drop a like if Amara earned every bit of her ending. And before you close this out, tell me one last time in the comments, where in the world did you watch this story from tonight? Thank you for staying until I'm coming. Became her whole world turning around. See you in the next one.